Prologue. The awakening from a terrible dream that became reality came from the first flashes of the day. The sky over the city opened its black arms, turning the world into a hellish maze. The streets that were once full of human voices and sounds were now spaces of silence, broken only by the crash of debris and the occasional ominous roar. It all started in a small laboratory, hidden somewhere on the periphery of scientific progress. Fascinated by the desire for greatness, the scientists turned their ambitions into what they now knew as Project Proton. They studied a virus capable of curing deadly diseases and enhancing human capabilities. But what promised to be a scientific breakthrough turned into a catastrophe of a planetary scale. In the early stages of testing, the virus showed promising results, but what started as a promising experiment quickly turned into a night terror. The experimental animals became aggressive, their eyes flashed with an ominous red light, and their behavior became less and less human. As is often the case in scientific experiments, the accident was only a matter of time. When the virus finally breaks free from the lab, the city is reduced to the size of a zombie pyramid, where the former people have turned into soulless monsters. At first, these were isolated cases, then an epidemic. Here and now, on the ruined streets, where everyday joys once reigned, walked those who were once called people. A group of survivors, left out of the epidemic shelling, had one goal: to reach the laboratory and stop the spread of the virus before it consumes all of humanity. Their every step into this ruin was calculated, every movement cautious. They knew that going back to the lab might be their last resort, but the other alternative was even worse. Only because of what once brought them here, a new battle begins, a fight not only for survival, but also for the restoration of humanity, which was lost in the midst of chaos and fear. And so, against the background of hostile darkness and devastation, begins an epic story of struggle and self-sacrifice, where each hero faces his own despair and hope for salvation. Chapter 1: The Beginning of the End. The morning in the metropolis began like an ordinary weekday. People were rushing to work, the streets were crowded with cars, and the air was filled with the noise of engines and conversations. But something unusual was happening in one of the large laboratories on the outskirts of the city. Dr. Olena Marchuk, the leading researcher of the new strain of the virus, sat in front of the monitor and looked anxiously at the data flashing on the screen. "This can't be true," she whispered. But all the signs pointed to one thing: the virus they were developing to treat cancer had mutated into something dangerous. The laboratory, which was engaged in the development of the latest biotechnologies, was one of the most modern in the world. The best scientists worked here, and their goal was noble: to create cures for incurable diseases. But the same virus that was supposed to save millions of lives got out of control. Due to the carelessness of one of the technicians, who did not follow the safety protocol, the virus sample got into the external environment. At first, no one noticed anything suspicious. But a few hours after the incident, the technician began to feel unwell. He developed a fever, became distracted, and later lost consciousness. When he was taken to the hospital, the doctors were puzzled. All the tests showed that he was healthy, but something invisible was killing him from the inside. They did not know that a virus had already begun to act in the technician's body, turning it into something completely different. While medics tried to save the technician's life, real panic began in the city. The virus spread extremely quickly, infecting everyone who came in contact with the patient. People began to turn to hospitals en masse with strange symptoms: weakness, dizziness, memory loss. But the doctors were powerless. No medicine worked. In a few days, patients began to lose control over themselves. Their eyes were bloodshot, their skin was pale, and they were foaming at the mouth. They rushed at nurses, other patients, trying to bite them, as if they were being led by some unknown force. The first cases of violence shocked the doctors, but no one guessed that this was just the beginning. At the same time, similar cases began to appear in different parts of the world. Outbursts of aggression, inexplicable illnesses, sudden deaths. The news reported a mysterious disease that had swept through several cities. Governments began to impose quarantines, but it was in vain. The virus seemed to have a mind of its own and bypassed all security measures with ease. Olena Marchuk understood that it was their mistake. They released something that should have remained closed in the laboratory. But the more she analyzed the data, the more fear gripped her. The virus didn't just kill, it changed people, turned them into monsters. Now she knew that it would be impossible to escape from this horror. Chapter 2: First Symptoms. Andrei, an ordinary office worker, woke up one morning with a heavy feeling in his head. He felt as if he hadn't slept at all. His whole body ached as if after a hard workout, even though he hadn't even been to the gym lately. He slowly got out of bed and saw that his eyes were red, as if all the blood vessels had burst. The mirror showed a pale face and chapped lips. Andrei decided to stay at home, but after a few hours his condition only worsened. It seemed that every minute something was taking away his strength. He tried to call the doctor, but the phone just kept beeping as if the lines were overloaded. Trying to get up from the bed, he suddenly felt a powerful flash of pain in his head. Everything went dark before his eyes and Andrei fell to the floor. The last thing he saw was his reflection in the mirror. It seemed distant, like he was looking at someone else. Meanwhile, similar cases began to be recorded en masse throughout the city. Videos of people with similar symptoms began to appear on social networks. Residents of the city began to panic, hospitals were overcrowded, and doctors did not know what to do. Dr. Olena Marchuk tried desperately to find an answer to the question of what is happening to people. She analyzed the blood of the infected and saw that the virus changes not only the physiology but also the psyche. It destroyed the central nervous system, depriving a person of reason, forcing him to act only on instincts. A few days after infection, patients began to lose their human features. They turned into creatures that had only one goal: to attack and infect others. The streets of the city became dangerous, and the authorities imposed a curfew. But it was too late. Andrei, like many others, did not cope with the virus. His body became only a shell for a new creature that craved fresh flesh. He roamed the streets of the city with the other infected, hunting those who were still alive. Chapter 3: Spread of Infection. The city, once large and bustling, now resembled a battlefield. The streets that once teemed with life became empty. A few weeks after the first infection, the virus spread throughout the city. The infection spread through air, water, and food. People were afraid to leave the house, but they did not feel safe in their own homes either. The authorities tried to introduce quarantine measures, but this only increased the panic. No medicine helped, and those who tried to flee the city were either shot at roadblocks or victims of their own panic. Roads were blocked, bridges blown up to stop the spread of the infection, but the virus found its way. The world watched the events in the city with fear and incomprehension. TV channels broadcast news about an unknown virus, governments declared a state of emergency, and one city after another closed their borders. But it was in vain. The virus has already gone beyond the city limits and started spreading around the world. International organizations tried to create a vaccine, but their efforts proved futile. The virus changed too quickly, constantly mutating, making the work of scientists difficult. People lost their minds en masse and became zombies, creatures without consciousness, driven only by the desire to kill. The city has become a real hell on earth. People who tried to hide in their homes became victims of their own fear. They lost control over themselves, lashed out at family members, neighbors, not realizing what was happening. The zombies were not like the ones shown in the movies. They did not wander slowly in search of a victim, but acted quickly, organized, as if guided by an invisible force. They united in a pack, searched for living people, and attacked them with incredible cruelty. A small group of people was hiding in one of the abandoned apartments in the city center. They were hiding from the zombies, trying to find a safe place. But they had to fight not only with an external threat, but also with internal tension. Panic, fear, and despair were slowly destroying them from the inside. A local park, once a peaceful place to relax, has become zombie territory. The trees, which witnessed many happy moments, have now become a shelter for monsters. Green lawns turned into bloody arenas where every sound could become a signal for an attack. Victoria, a young woman who used to live near the park, found temporary shelter in an old underpass. She was accompanied by 3 other people whom she had met while escaping from her own home. They tried not to pay attention to the horrors that were happening upstairs, but they knew that sooner or later they would have to get out. The zombies became more and more organized. They were no longer mere animals following the scent of flesh. They acted like a pack of predators looking for their prey. They knew that people were hiding and they were ready to do anything to find them. Victoria and her companions decided to make their way to a nearby hospital where medical supplies and possibly weapons were rumored to remain. But the road was dangerous. They had to make their way through dark streets full of traps. With every step they took, they felt the presence of zombies watching them from around the corner or hiding in the shadows. When they reached the hospital, they realized that their hopes were in vain. The place was deserted, and all the medicines had been stolen a long time ago. But their biggest nightmare was that the zombies were already inside. Victoria felt fear as she saw one of the creatures slowly approach them. She was once a nurse. Now her eyes glowed red and her mouth contorted in agony. It was the last moment before the attack. The zombies charged at the group, tearing through the air with their eerie screams. Victoria felt cold hands squeezing her shoulders, but managed to fire a pistol she found in one of the empty rooms. The shot rang out loudly, knocking the creature back. She knew their time was limited, but she felt inside that the zombies were only getting stronger. The surviving group was made up of different people. Victoria, a former nurse who lost her entire family in the early days of the outbreak. Maxim, a former policeman who knew the streets of the city like the back of his hand. Yuri, a teenager who found them after his family disappeared during one of the zombie attacks. And Serhi, a former military man who led them, trying to preserve the remnants of order in this chaos. They were all different, but they had one thing in common: the desire to survive. Each of them had their own history of loss and struggle, but they all understood that without cooperation their chances were reduced to zero. They decided to move to the old laboratory, where, according to Victoria, the epidemic began. She hoped that there she could find an answer, or at least a way to stop this horror. Serhi supported this idea because he knew that in this place there might be stocks of weapons that would help them break through. The road to the laboratory was not easy. The city was full of dangers. Zombies were waiting at every turn. The group had to move quickly and carefully, avoid loud noises, and move only at night when the streets were less crowded. Maxim, as a former policeman, knew his way around the city well and was able to lead them through abandoned buildings and underground passages. He knew where the largest concentrations of zombies were and how to avoid the traps. Yuri was agile and quick, often sneaking forward to scout the way. He became their eyes and ears in this new world. Victoria focused on keeping the group in good health. She bandaged wounds, tried to find the remains of medicines in abandoned pharmacies, and convinced everyone to stick together. But she was most afraid that the virus could be in each of them. Serhi led them, made difficult decisions, and tried to prevent the group from falling apart. He understood that there were only 2 forces left in this world: the zombies and those who had not yet given up. And he was not going to become one of the victims. Days turned into weeks as the group continued their perilous journey through the ruined city. They saw the zombies becoming more aggressive and their attacks more organized. Survival became more and more difficult, but what depressed them the most was the loss of hope. One day, while the group was in one of the abandoned factories, they were attacked by a large group of zombies. Maxim, who was covering them from behind, became the first victim. He did not manage to move away in time and was knocked to the ground. His screams echoed around the room and then abruptly stopped. This loss was a real blow for everyone. Maxim was an important part of the group, and his death left a void in everyone's hearts. Yuri, who became very attached to him, withdrew into himself and no longer spoke to anyone. They lost one of the best, but they couldn't stop. They had to leave his body where it fell and move on, bearing the burden of their loss. So he felt how each step became unbearably heavy. They were exhausted both physically and mentally. With each passing day, his faith that they could reach the lab dwindled. He saw it in the eyes of Victoria and Yuri. Hope slowly faded like the last light in the darkness. Yuri, who had once been energetic and brave, now looked depressed. After Maxim's death, he hardly spoke and stayed away from others. His eyes, always alert and alive, were now empty and lifeless. Victoria tried to cheer him up, but all her efforts were in vain. One evening, when the group stopped for a short rest in an old abandoned building, Sergei decided to talk to Yuri. He understood that if they lost the boy, it could mean the end for everyone. "Yuri," Sergei said quietly, sitting down next to him, "I know what you're worried about and that it's hard for you right now. We've all lost someone important, but Maxim would like us to keep fighting. We have to get to the laboratory. If there is even the slightest chance to stop it, we must use it." Yuri looked up at Sergei. They were filled with tears and pain, but he nodded anyway. I just can't take it anymore. All I see around me is death. We've all become a burden to each other. You are not a burden, Yuri. We all support each other to stay alive. This is not just a battle for survival. This is a battle for our humanity. We must stick together or we will give up. Sergei's words, though full of determination, seemed empty, even to himself. But they awakened a spark of hope in Yuri. The boy understood that they had already gone too far to give up. Victoria, who was watching their conversation from across the room, sighed softly. Her soul was burdened, but she knew she had to stay strong for everyone's sake. Now more than ever, she felt responsible for what had happened and was determined to get to the lab to find a way to stop the virus. The next morning they moved on, making their way through deserted streets and ruined buildings. Each new step was difficult, but they never looked back. Sergei and Victoria walked ahead, paving the way, while Yuri stayed close, focused and ready to act. With each passing day, they could feel the infection intensifying around them. The zombies became more and more aggressive, attacking suddenly and brutally. Several times they had to fight, using whatever was at hand, knives, sticks, even broken bricks. When they finally reached the suburbs, the first ray of hope appeared. The laboratory appeared on the horizon, a large concrete structure that looked as if it could hold anything. But even this place did not promise an easy entry. Remains of military equipment and traces of battles could be seen around the building. It was obvious that there had been some recent fighting. Victoria felt her heart freeze. The laboratory in which she had placed so much hope could be as dangerous as the rest of the city. But there was no other way out. If there was a way to stop the virus, it was inside this building. The group slowly approached the entrance to the laboratory. The heavy metal door was firmly shut, but the traces of blood and torn parts of the gate indicated that terrible things had already happened inside. Sergei looked around, trying to figure out how they could get inside. "We have to find another entrance," he said, scanning the walls around the building. "Perhaps the ventilation or the service entrance. The main thing is not to panic." After a few minutes of searching, Victoria found a small door on the other side of the building. It led to the underground level of the laboratory. The door was locked, but after several blows, Sergei managed to open it. It was dark inside, and the air smelled musty and rotten. The room was empty, but it felt like someone had been there recently. As they walked along the corridors, they could hear soft sounds echoing off the walls. They were like screams or moans, muffled and distant. When they reached the central room, it became clear that the situation was serious. The bodies of scientists and soldiers lay everywhere, their faces distorted with horror, but not all the bodies were dead. Victoria realized this when one of them moved sharply, rising to its feet. "Zombie! Back!" Sergei shouted, pulling out his weapon. He fired at the creature, but it only attracted the attention of the others. More zombies began to appear from all sides, who were once people working in this laboratory. The group was trapped. They had to retreat to another part of the building, where the door automatically closed behind them. Sergei shot the zombies that were closest and barricaded the door with all available objects to slow down the pursuers. "We have to find a server room or a command center," Victoria said, breathing hard. "There may be information on how to stop the virus, or at least data on its mutations." They continued on their way, making their way through new rooms full of terrible scenes. The laboratory, which was supposed to be a place of hope, turned into the last outpost of human tragedy. But they continued to go forward, because there was no choice. After an hour of searching, they finally found a room with a central computer. It was the heart of the laboratory, where all the information about the research and experiments carried out here was stored. Victoria quickly went to the computer and started checking the data. "There's something here," she whispered. "Information about the mutation of the virus. They knew it could get out of control." She quickly looked through the files, trying to find something that might help. Eventually, she found a plan of action in case the virus got out of control. The plan included the destruction of all samples of the virus and the self-destruction of the laboratory. "There's a self-destruct protocol here," Victoria said to the others. "We can destroy the lab along with all the virus samples. That might stop it from spreading, but we can't get out of here." Sergei understood that this was their last chance. They could try to leave the lab and leave things as they are, or they could take the risk and destroy the virus with them. But it was a chance to save those who were still alive. "We have to do this," he said, looking firmly at Victoria. "This is our only chance to stop this horror." Yuri silently agreed, realizing that this meant the end. They entered the self-destruct protocol activation code and began the countdown. The countdown began, and the group realized that time was running out. They decided to try to find a way out, although everyone understood that the chances of success were slim. So he took on the responsibility of leading the group, once again relying on his military skills. He was looking for any possible way out, any way to avoid inevitable death. They made their way through the corridors, bypassing the traps and zombies that remained inside. Every second seemed to drag on forever. Victoria could feel her heart beating faster, but she continued to walk forward. When they finally reached the exit, it became apparent that all avenues of escape were blocked. They were trapped, but no one retreated. Everyone understood that they had made the right choice. The laboratory, along with all its horrors, had to disappear, and with it the terrible virus that destroyed their world. The countdown ended and the lab exploded, engulfing everything around it. But along with it, the virus that was a threat to all of humanity disappeared. Epilogue. The world after the disaster was left devastated, but the people who survived began to rebuild their lives. They realized that despite all the horrors they had to endure, their struggle was not in vain. The memory of those who sacrificed themselves for the sake of saving humanity remained in the hearts of those who survived. Victoria, Sergei, Yuri, and Maxim became symbols of the struggle for life, hope, and humanity. And while the world will never be the same, a new generation grew up, knowing that their world was saved thanks to those who did not give up even in the darkest of times.